Hi, this is Richard Fields with this week's Report from the Fields. In these reports, I have repetitively made the point that inflation is effectively a sales tax. Government spending that is not funded through taxes is funded through money creation. That eventually results in inflation. Federal debt is 39 trillion of direct borrowing and counting, but 175 trillion if you include unfunded liabilities, mainly Social Security and Medicare, but who cares about that? For perspective, that's over $500,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country. The people, insurance companies, pension funds, and other institutions in the United States lend a lot of money to the federal government by buying U.S. Treasuries, notes, and bills. Foreign governments, institutions, and individual investors buy a lot more of that debt. But the combined lending of all of the aforementioned doesn't come close to satisfying the government's gargantuan appetite for more borrowing to fund more government spending. Where does the rest of that lending come from? The short answer is the Federal Reserve Bank. And where does the Fed get the money to lend to the government? Well, it has the power to create it. If we did that, it would be called counterfeiting. Printing currency is not the way the Fed creates most new money, although through the Treasury Department, it is a small part of it. Mostly what the Fed does is purchase treasuries of various maturities from commercial banks. It pays for those treasuries with keystroke-created new money. That effectively lowers short-term interest rates. And then the banks have cash, which they can lend to consumers and businesses. More bank lending means more currency in the economy. When the growth of that currency grows faster than the growth of the economy, prices go up. And eventually, long-term interest rates go up. It's that simple. But it's not that obvious. The inflation effect is usually delayed. When LBJ was borrowing money in the early 70s to fund both his Great Society and the Vietnam War, the inflation showed up in the late 70s. When the first Trump administration was giving people stimmy checks in 2020 to compensate them for his COVID shutdown of the economy, the inflation didn't show up until 2021 and 2022. In addition, consumer price index numbers don't capture all of the inflation going on. First of all, the Bureau of Labor Statistics games the statistics with heuristics and substitution effects. If your new iPhone costs the same as the last one but does more stuff, the BLS calls that a price decrease. If steak gets too expensive and you switch to hamburger, the BLS says you're still spending the same amount of money on meat, so prices have not gone up. But secondly, and more importantly, the BLS does not recognize inflation in assets, stocks and bonds, and real estate. If the price of stocks goes up faster than their earnings do, that's inflation. The shorthand for that is the price-earnings ratio. The PE has more than tripled since the 1970s. Of course, the rich, people who own assets, are just fine with that. They benefit from inflation. Those of us with few assets, living paycheck to paycheck and watching paychecks rise more slowly than food and gas, are not similarly blessed. The pertinent question we should be asking is whether government funding a huge proportion of its expenditures through inflation can last indefinitely. Without any historical exceptions, the answer is no. The Roman Empire, Weimar Germany in 1922-23, the Kingdom of Hungary in 1945-46, Yugoslavia in 1992-94, Zimbabwe in 2007-2008, and many more all ended up with hyperinflation, leading to social unrest and government upheaval. Having the global reserve currency like the United States does now just slows down the process a bit. Our reserve currency status, expressed as the amount of world trade conducted in dollars, has been going down for a few years now. At various times in history, the currencies of Rome, Spain, the Netherlands, Great Britain, and many others have been the most important reserve currencies. They've all eventually lost that role due to inflating their currencies to pay for government overspending. Will the practice of using inflation to fund government spending go on indefinitely? Nope. Eventually, the United States will run out of lenders willing to lend us money at a sustainable rate. With his spending on a voluntary war in Iran and other spending, Trump is accelerating that process. That's this week's Report from the Fields. I'm Richard Fields. See you again next week.